And we're back with another episode of Inside the War Room. Ryan Ray here with the Matrix himself, Mark Rossano. Mark, it's good to have you on, buddy. How you doing?
It's an absolute pleasure. No, good. Just I actually got some sleep last night, which was nice because the girls are away at my in-laws. So it's always a nice little break. Get a little bit of sleep, and then they come back tomorrow.
There you go. I got four. I know how that goes. So you've been on. I think you're probably the most recurring guest we've had. You and Anas. This is your fourth appearance. But I've got to ask. This time next week, I think exactly almost. I'll be recording with the one, the only Tiger King star herself, Carol Baskin. So between now and next time, the dynamics of the show will change. And so, do you feel pressure that your performance needs to be up today? Are you going to break down her game film in preparation for you to come back next time? It's a big ask. I mean, a lot of
I
pressure.
will. Well, I'm gonna have to break down the game film. I want to see what kind of hat she wore, what kind of outfit, to see if I need to step up my wardrobe game because I'm obviously always going with the Under Armour, so I might need to shake it up. I mean, you're in a jacket. I feel like I'm gonna have to start dressing up in suits here.
Hey, listen, I will say this because I doubt he's listening. One of my guests comes on, and I was getting ready to go out of town, and so I had a hat on, t-shirt, which is what I wear on most days, anyways. But I was definitely wearing it. I was about to be in the truck for 6.5 hours with nothing to do, and he comes on. We're in the back room. He goes, "Glad to see we dressed up today." He had the tie on, the 6. I was like, "Oh,
Yeah.
okay." It's a podcast, bro. It's a podcast.
Yep.
It's a podcast. So that's the beauty of these things is that they are a little bit more laid back, and it's an audio format. It's an audio format. We do put them on YouTube for those of you who do listen along, but it's mainly an audio format. Okay, Mark. The bad part about this interview is there's not a lot going on in the world, so I don't know what to talk about.
I know everything's. I mean, geopolitically speaking, everything is so quiet. I mean, who knew?
It's so calm. It's so peaceful right now in the world. The economy's going great. Kamala Harris is traveling the world. So let's talk about the U.S. economy because there's not really much there, I'm sure. But what's going on?
One of the things that we've been talking about and highlighting is that things are really starting to slow after that initial run up. You had government transfers, obviously, that were coming through, and that has started to finish out. Now, some of it's being replaced with the per child payments. So you're starting to see that really take effect and really kind of create these impacts. And if you look at a lot of these leading indicators, we've already seen it start to show up, like the Richmond Fed coming out. You look at Empire, Philly, they're all coming in well below estimates, well below, and again, and I always like to preface this. It's still growth. No one is saying that we're not growing. It's just way below where estimates are, way below where we were, as we're now on the other side of a lot of this growth.
And
now,
growth,
sorry, go
growth. When you say growth, compared to what? That's
Compa-
important to distinguish.
So when you're looking at a lot of these indices, they can be negative. So you like when you look at PMI, for an example, PMI 50 is nothing is happening. Everything is the same as it was the previous month. So if you're above 50, you're in an expansionary territory. If you're below 50, you're in a contractionary territory. And then when you look at a lot of these leading indicators, you can be below zero, and then you're actually contracting again. So when you're looking at something like, let's just take some of these Fed numbers where you could be at, 26, 30, and which is off of zero, where you're coming in at 9, 6. And so you're still growing, but you're not growing where expectations were and where you previously were if you look back over the last few months. So when you're looking at a lot of these data sets, they're coming in just eking out some sort of growth, but whiffing against estimates because these expectations for the market still remain far too elevated for what the hard data is actually putting in, which is when you start looking at the city surprise index, the city surprise inflation index. It just kind of shows you that everything is surprising on the inflation side to the upside, and then on the hard data side to the downside, which is just it's a long way of saying that the market is at all-time highs and the economic data just does not support that kind of strength.
Okay, so when I go around, we're talking offline. I was in Biloxi last weekend, and I think the place I stayed, It was down in Biloxi, so there's casinos down there. I think that their buffet had shut down, and if you know casinos, the buffet's the kind of the big attraction to try to get people in. Oh, okay, the casino's a big thing, but you know the food side, they're trying to get you those buffets. Theirs is shut down. I know that almost every little fast food joint I stopped. I went down to Houston, and then from Houston to Biloxi, every little fast food joint was hiring. I've heard I had someone at my house a week or two ago, and they told me that the Waffle Houses where they're from are not working 24 hours because they don't have no staff. So it feels as if you're walking around in society that, and you're kind of being observant, and you would go, something's a little bit off here. Is unemployment at max? Like, are we 100% unemployed, 100% employment? Because there's a lot of people looking for folks out there, and they're just not there, it seems. What's going on?
Well, you have we're coming up to the expiration of the extended benefits, so that's going to help drive people back into either the office or into some sort of setting like you're describing when you think about hospitality and restaurants. But when you start looking a bit more broadly, you have to consider what is full employment, and then at the same time, how many people are available to work. Because I think one of the bigger things that we've seen because of COVID was this acceleration on retirements. So when you look at people that have now permanently left the workforce, will that remain permanent? Remains to be seen. But some of these individuals have chosen to retire. So that takes away, I think, some of these individuals that are going to come back. And when you look at the birth rate and the amount of individuals that are available to work, it's really kind of flatlined since about 2010. And you haven't seen that working age really increase. So the available workers is coming down, mixed with retirements, mixed with extended benefits. So now as these extended benefits expire, you're going to see individuals that are going to come back into these jobs. They're going to have to find a way to replicate essentially what they lost out or what they were paid to stay at home with. And this is where it's going to be interesting as well. Now, that's one side of it. But then the other side, there's the company side, because companies are sitting there saying, okay, well, I keep hearing there's a lot of unemployed people. There's still 10 million on the sidelines, 10 to 12 million, depending on the week. So why am I can be picky too. I'm going to be the one that wants the right skill set. I'm going to want the person I don't need to train that much.
Right.
So you're seeing this friction because the labor is essentially saying, you're not paying me enough. And then the companies are saying, you don't have the right skill set. So you're getting this standoff between the two. And that's not so much a Waffle House. You can train someone to work at a Waffle House, but that's more along the lines of, when you start going into the office and you start going into some of these more, manufacturing things that need a bit more skills that you maybe,
Project
have to
managers,
learn.
junior level
Right.
engineers, production people, stuff like that they're not, it's not an entry level job, but it's also not top of the food chain.
Exactly. And that's where you're seeing this bifurcation in the market where, when you look at the small business, like the NFSIB puts out, and you look at what they're saying, and they're essentially saying that they can't find workers. And it's, can they not find them, or are they just not willing to hire who's coming through the door? And I think it's a mixture of both.
Okay. So let me ask you this. What percentage, and this is an unknown, I assume, of course, you know everything, so you might know.
I pretend.
You pretend, hey, it works for me. What percentage of people during COVID either took the early retirement, not because they wanted to retire, but or they got laid off, or they got let go, or they, whatever. And all those groups of people we just talked about, and they decided to work for themselves, whether that's driving an Uber, working on Fiverr, or consulting, or whatever. And so they're not going to be back in the workforce as they historically have, because they figured out a way to make money without having to go to the big corporate office anymore. Do any read on what percentage of the workforce that's going to be, or how much that's changed?
Yeah, one of the things that's always been amazing about Americans is our willingness to innovate and create and tinker in a garage. And that when you look at the new LLCs that were started, patents that were filed, you can get an idea that the same thing happened again, and that we did see a big uptick in LLCs being formed, more on the partnership side. And when you look at why an individual would do that and why a company would be okay with it. So if you say you work for IBM, you took a package to retire, and you take that package, you go and you're like, you know what, I still have something left in the tank. I don't really want to work 5 days a week. I'm okay working 3 days a week. Well, they'll start up an LLC and then they'll become a consultant. And the reason why they would do it, it brings in cash. And then you can be a 1099 instead of a W-2. And for those that don't know what that's referring to, is when you're thinking about taxes, when you work for a company and you're W-2, there's taxes that are going to be attached to you. There's going to be, they might have a benefits package. So they're going to have to pay for some of your healthcare. They're going to have to pay for dental, vision, where if you're a 1099 consultant, that's on you. So they don't have to pay unemployment benefits. They don't have to worry about your benefits package. So there's a certain amount of, let's just say, shifting the burden of this, filing taxes, benefits onto these individuals. And I think that's where you're starting to see some of that come back up. How much of it, lasts is always going to be another question. But when you look at what has been filed and what patents have been filed, there has been an uptick. What percentage, I can, based on the data that's come out, there's been like almost a 30% increase in the amount of LLCs filed. And that's something that we normally see during downturns, during these when people are locked in place. The difference now going forward, to companies that are struggling with, do I really need this? If I own 5 floors, do I really need the 5th? If I own this building, do I really need to own this building? And that's when we're starting to see commercial real estate come back into question, because can I just have a few consultants that I've now outsourced? Do I need 5 floors worth of individuals here, or do I need 3? And that's where you're starting to. That's how that kind of continues to branch down into even the commercial real estate sector.
Yeah, I'll just tell you, one of the things that I've been doing is some advisory work, and it works out pretty well for the customer because they don't have to hire a full-time person.
Right.
They can pay me a much reduced rate on a retainer, a commission on the back end, and the risk is pretty low, the exposure is pretty low. So new creative things are out there. And I think that in 2018, 2019, you could have struck some of these deals. They're harder to find, but right now you're going, okay, do we really need to bring in someone for $150,000, $200,000, whatever it is? I don't know, 120,000. Pay them a commission, pay them insurance, pay them all this stuff, or can we work out these deals with people and maybe get a better ROI and just have a smaller workforce? I think you've seen that through all levels, right? That whether it's commercial real estate, whether it's small businesses or even bigger businesses.
Well, and you're seeing where a lot of these individuals are essentially leaving the company and then getting hired back to the same company just under an LLC consulting agreement. So they essentially offloaded a lot of this risk that they no longer need. And they, maybe your job really wasn't a 5-day-a-week job. Maybe it was 3 days a week. Maybe it was, working, maybe instead of, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, it's really 5 hours a day, 5 days a week. And then you start using your time differently. And it's almost like this new growth of the gig economy that's now been expanded, where the gig economy I'm referring to is, you need blinds installed. So you go hire someone on different apps, something like that is getting a little bit bigger. And it always does. And then it starts to shrink back down because, somebody comes in, they're like, wow, this person's really smart. I don't want anyone else to have their expertise. I'm going to hire them. So then I have them and they're under my umbrella, and I don't have to worry about them taking information or things that they're sharing with me and sharing it with my competitors. So it's just going to be a matter of how long does that last? And then when does that start to shift back?
No, that's a great point. What you'll see is that, on the vendor side, not even on the employee side, that companies they'll have 100 vendors they're using to build a project, and they'll say, you know what, let's bring in 50% of those vendors in house, and so then they'll bring them in house, and so then they'll say, oh, that's too expensive, let's put them back out in vendors. So you're seeing the same thing here, I think, with employment. And so, but the only thing I would push back on that's a little bit different this time is that you have a situation now where companies and more companies will move towards mandatory vaccinations. They might make you wear a mask all the time. Some of these requirements that have changed will make people go, I'm not sure if I want to be in the corporate environment as much. Whereas when we're talking about returning to the new normal, it was, okay, well, do you want to go back to the office? Well, now going back to the office might mean you got to get a shot. You might got to wear a mask. You might got to social distance or whatever it might be. So I think there's some other things at play here from the workforce side as well.
I agree, and people have now gotten used to working from home or working with a bit more flexibility, and now it's becoming a must, not a nice to have.
Hmm.
And we're seeing that now, where people and based on the fact that there's these jobs available, people are essentially saying, look, if you're not going to allow me to stay working from home because I am uncomfortable, or I like not having an hour commute each way, if you're not going to allow me to maintain some of that flexibility, I'm just going to go find another job and find someone who will. So you're starting to see that come back into play, where, work-life balance is always that question that you ask in the interview, or something that is talked about during the interview process. But now it's not just, well, this is what you could have if you come here. It's like, no, this is what I must have.
Hmm.
If you want me, this is what I must have. I must have Mondays and Wednesdays at home. I have to have Thursdays and Fridays at home. Like, those are things that are getting baked into the market more and more on a growing level. And it's a mix, because you'll talk to some people and they'll say productivity's down, it's terrible, it's what hurting culture, which is why I think you're going to see the adoption of a flex schedule become more prominent versus a straight work from home. And it's just going to be a matter of where does that balance out over time. But I do think that there is going to be a marked shift in the way work is done, who has that ownership. And then again, it's coming back to companies. What is the biggest cost for companies? It's real estate and labor.
Hmm.
So if you can find ways to reduce both of those entities, I mean, you're going to do everything you can to change those cost centers.
Well, I think the other thing to consider is, if you're on the employee side, you probably need to realize, um, this is not for every employee, but a lot of employees were getting carried a lot of hours at jobs, because they were just a 40-hour week employee, right?
Mhm.
If you really said, how much work do you really have to do in a week? It's not 40 hours. There are some jobs that's the case, some jobs it's more, obviously, but there's plenty of jobs out there that really weren't 40-hour week jobs. But to get, you wanted benefits and this, that, and the other, your 40-hour week job. So if your company, to your point, well, why not bring in more contractors who can
Right.
work 30 hours, 20 hours, and you don't have to do this extra cost? And on the flip side, if you're an employee and your job was really only 20 hours, but you're like, okay, I could work two 20-hour jobs at different rates, right? So or three 20-hour jobs, because now there's no moonlight clause. So I think both sides, if they look at for the right opportunity, this could be really beneficial, because now if you're an employee, you could say, you know what, I'm an independent contractor and I'm gonna go out and get 4 or 5 different clients, because my task is not trade secrets or anything like this. And I can do it for 4 or 5 companies, make more money, work my own schedule, work at home.
Mhm.
And if you're the company, to your point, I would promote this as well. You can't do it for everyone, but promote this as, this is good for the employees. Hey, listen, if you want to take this route, we encourage you to go work for 3 or 4 companies, be your own boss, make your own hours.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that'll catch on, but I think that's the opportunity
Well,
here.
it's funny, I didn't notice the billboard on the way home yesterday, but when I was coming back from my in-laws in Rhode Island, as you enter New York, there's a big billboard essentially pitching, why live in a closet when you can live in a mansion, and it's all about moving to Ohio
Mhm.
from New York for work from home, and that's when you're starting to see these shifts. And do I need to be in a tiny bedroom, one
Right.
bedroom, $4,000 a month apartment, or can I live, with a great mortgage? Now, New Yorkers moving out because there's a different value on money when you go to Ohio or some of these other areas that have a lot of space. That's when you start seeing these bidding wars, but it's still cheaper on a mortgage basis to buy some of these areas, and it's just, again, that better work life balance and a bit happier existence, if you will.
Okay, let's talk about a little bit of oil prices. They are right now, at the time of this recording, $67.58 WTI, 70.95 Brent. That's the old stuff. You've got the actual live price on your little terminal over there, but that's close enough for government work.
Yep.
What's your read on prices right now?
So one of the things that I was saying that when we were talking, I think it was we had a conversation on, that July 5th. I was like, look, oil prices are stupid here. This makes no sense. There's a lot of downside risk. And then, my near term target was actually got into just below 65. So we went right through that. And then my expectation was to see a bounce. So I think we're going to continue to see a bit of a rally here to about 68. You have a lot of things coming your way. You have the inflation trade is back, the reflation trade. You have, all of these narratives getting thrown around. People said that the down move was because of Delta. So then Delta is starting to peak. So then you have a lot of narratives going through. And then the biggest one is OPEC, where what is OPEC going to do? Are they going to limit the cuts? Are they going to slow down? Are they going to pause? Or is it going to be business as usual? And my expectation is business as usual. I think there's a lot of uncertainty, but at the same time, they want to take their market share. The prices still remain robust even after a correction of, let's call it $8, and they're looking to capitalize, and I don't see that stopping. Now, if one of the things that we've talked about is, could they bring back the cuts? And I don't think there is the political will within OPEC to reinstitute cuts. I think they could make a negotiation to pause them, but I don't think you would ever see them reinstitute the broad-based cuts that we have seen.
With the price where it's at, I was talking about this yesterday. It's fine for U.S. producers. It's not like it's so 65 to 72 or whatever, 75. But, it's dropped, but it's not in the danger zone yet. So the danger zone for me is you get sub 55. I think producers start kind of looking like, oh, okay, we're a little concerned, and then you get to 50. So as long as we stay in this range, we should be okay. But production, I know we hit over 500 rigs, but production really isn't blowing through the roof in the U.S. What's going on here? Is it money? Is it drilling schedules? Is it creeping up at the right pace? I know you get the frac spread that you guys do. Mm-hmm. What's kind of your read on drilling?
So one of the things that we had said back in December was that we had a target of about 11.3 to 11.5 million barrel a day exit rate. And we shifted that in March just based on the speed in which these frac spreads really came back to about 11.5 to 11.7, and really much closer to 11.6 exit rate. And the reason why is, we don't have the same type of will to get back to 13 million. And let's be fair, we shouldn't. We overshot where demand was for US crude, which is light, which is sweet. But it has some issues in terms of a bit acidic paraffins, which is just waxy pieces within the oil itself. That just means that on the refining side, petchem side, they have to do remediation to account for the heavy metals, the acidic cuts, and the wax. So we outpaced not only domestic demand but also international demand. So going through 2018 into 2019 and even the first quarter of 2020, we were adding drilled but uncompleted wells at a massive clip, which would just because we expected to get to 15 million barrels a day. And then obviously COVID happened. But, and I say this on a regular basis, I was bearish in 2019 because we were already seeing slowing. We were already seeing pressure points. As of July of 19, you started to see the cracks on the wall. So when you look at COVID, that just accelerated things. So now we get to the other side of it, and companies are sitting there saying, okay, well, why am I going to run back up, increase all these costs, drill wells so far ahead? Well, why? Let's get back to pace. Let's get back to a comfortable setting. And I think that's where we sit. So I actually just published another article that just came out today on AOGR. And when it's just looking at rigs versus frac spreads. And our view was that Q3 was going to see an acceleration of rig counts versus spread counts. And it's not that spreads or, frac spreads were going to go down. It's just that rigs were going to run ahead of them to stem the decline of DUCs, to start to kind of get into a balancing act. And you're going to see, rigs get to, over to about 650 on an exit rate. And you're going to get frac spreads to about 275. And I don't see movement too far above that. I don't think there's any real will at this point to get past that. Could we get to 12 million to 12.3 million barrels a day in 2022? Sure. Then that's going to be based on price. That's going to be based on some of this demand, but I just don't think there's the will or the necessity to see 15 million barrels a day coming out of the US with a large part of that having to be taken down by the international market, because our refiners are built to take heavy sour. Like, we're built to take this stuff from Venezuela, Mexico, the Middle East, because that's where the cost was, the cost benefit was, where you would buy the stuff that nobody wanted and turn it into great products, but you needed a complex refiner. You needed a lot of processes to make sure that you could utilize that and turn it into something useful. So we essentially saturated the world and the US with light sweet, with a lot of that not being able to go into our refiners and having to get exported. Now, since then, they have developed, or I should say built out, a bit more on the lighter end, where there would be hydroskimming, more alkylation units, more reformate units, to try to maximize the usage. But there's only so much you can do before it's just you're running inefficiently. So we're always going to be beholden to what can the international world take down, and we've already seen them say it's too much.
We're almost towards the end of driving season here. How has gasoline demand been in the U.S.?
Gasoline demand. Now I'm going to tout myself, and I know that that's probably bad form, but it did exactly what I said it was going to do in March, where you were going to see a seasonal increase, which along seasonal lines, but we were never going to get back to where we were from 16 to 19. And it's just because everything we just talked about, working from home, people still a little skittish about COVID. And the one thing that I've always said, you don't need the government to mandate things. The consumer will naturally take their own steps to protect. And, maybe instead of going to Target 5 times, you went 2 times. Instead of going, 2 times this week, you're going to skip this week. You're going to see how things shake out. You're going to utilize, hey, I can use Target online. I can change my buying habits and minimize risk to myself and my family. And that's what we've seen. And that's what we've continued to see, because there's still this uncertainty of, well, what is Delta? What is Lambda? What other Greek alphabet letter we want to use? So when you start seeing this, and then you have people that like working from home and like not being in the office, and those are the types of shifts. So our view was weekday activity was going to be 15 to 20% below normal, and weekend activity was going to be 5 to 7% above normal, where people were going to do less during the week, just because they're not driving to work, they're not, going away as much, and they're going to do more on the weekends, parks, going outside, traveling to see family that they haven't seen in 14 months. So that it was going to be this waiting, and you saw that. And the same thing where you had a seasonal increase, but it just never got to where we have been. And then if you look at TSA data, departures data, the same thing played out, where you had a seasonal increase, but it was always 500 to 750,000 below 2019 levels. And now you're starting to see it come back down with seasonal. And I think, I don't know why, but apparently if you haven't had a seasonal impact in a year, people forget that you can look over the last 50 years and seasonality matters. Somebody was telling me today that, not today, was it 2 weeks ago, that school buses are going to be all the difference in the fall. It's like, so we haven't had school buses in all of the other years. So school buses are just a brand new thing that's going to absorb all of this. I was like, come on, guys, like just seasonality. Just look at this, season by season, like when people talk about, demand in July is the highest it's been since COVID started. It's like, so we're going to compare July to March. That's where we are now. It's like, okay, whatever keeps the narrative alive.
Well, okay, so for folks who maybe aren't familiar with all these terms, let's unpack this. When you're saying seasonality, what you're saying is that certain portions of the year, historically, we see that demand is here compared to where it was the previous season. So it might go up or down depending on what's going on. So the season we're about to go into, gasoline demand, seasonally speaking, will go down regardless of what's going on in the world. That's just how it works. Now, diesel demand, theoretically, I don't know the answer to this question, diesel demand theoretically could go up because of the school buses, right?
Well, it's
I'm
just
curious, but overall, that wouldn't fix the seasonality of the gasoline demand problem.
Correct. Well, and if you look at just what has happened when we turn back to the seasonality side, you think about what you do normally. Do you drive more in July or do you drive more in November?
Right.
And that's just when you're thinking, you can't compare the two. You have to compare all of the Julys together, all of the August together. And then you turn to the fall. And what is fall? It's school. People go back to school. You can't take your kid out of school, and go to Disney World, or, you can, but you might get in trouble. You look at some of these things where the vacations dip, you start to get into more of a routine again. And that's some of the difference. One of the things that we also did say, and this was actually back in 2020, was that you were going to get a very strong diesel response. And it was just because the supply chains were so banged up, they still remain significantly impacted, that you were going to have a bigger reliance on trucking, which was going to pull in more diesel. And that's continued to be the case. So diesel's always been on the bright spot. If you look at the main driving or transportation fuels, which is gasoline, distillate, jet fuel, kerosene, and residual fuels, which, when you look to shipping. So when you're looking at these transportation fuels, diesel's always been the bright spot. It's the other areas that you saw a lot of weakness, and we've continued to see not so much extensive weakness, but just not back to where I think the market was expecting as we entered this pent up demand summer driving season.
So to go back to your comment about gasoline demand is the highest in July since COVID started, a better way to frame that would be as gasoline demand is the highest. And this, I'm just making up a number here.
Mm-hmm.
Gasoline demand theoretically is as high as it was in July 2019. That would have been a better way to measure that. Or
Correct.
gasoline demand is 67% higher year over year, but it's still 20% lower than 2019, right? So then you're framing it in a way it's relative to what it should be, and it actually makes sense. Where if you're saying, in the way that it's proposed, that you'd say, well, it's highest since COVID started March of 2019, which actually means July is normally 30% higher.
Mm-hmm.
You'd have to really unpack all of that other stuff. You could, but that's not what's being presented.
Correct. And that's why it's always and one of the things we said was, look, 2020 was a unique time. It will never be as bad as 2020. But where are we in comparison to 2016 to 2019 in that time frame? Because when you go through, we've added, shockingly, I know, we've added miles to the road essentially every year going back to, the 1990s. So it's 16 should be, and then things have started to level off, and we're not adding as many miles just because we've started to saturate the market with cars and just the amount that our infrastructure can handle. So you went, that's why I compare it to what were we in 16, 17, 18, and 19 versus today, because that's going to give you a better bellwether of how close to normal are we.
It's interesting when you talk about adding miles. I could see the case that Uber could add a lot of miles, or it could also take away a lot of miles, because someone who, if you're in a big city and you had a car, you go, okay, I'm not getting a car now. I'm just going to Uber everywhere because it's cheaper and it's more effective. Yep. And so I took away a bunch of miles. On the flip side, someone who's like, the taxi system sucks, it's a pain in the butt, but now I can Uber, it's a lot more effective. Or if you're 16, 17, 18-year-old getting an Uber, I could see that as well. So has Uber played any role, do you know, about the miles? Because I could kind of see it having impact on both sides.
It's actually it's almost like a negating factor, because you had people, kids that would have gotten cars that didn't want cars, parents that no longer had to drive their kids because they could Uber everywhere. But then if you look at cities, they actually replaced a lot of the taxi side. And if for anybody who's actually walked through New York can attest to the fact that they've actually created way more problems than they fixed, because there were so many Ubers on the road and Lyfts and what other companies are out there, that they've gunked up the system. So now you have so much gridlock, you have so many issues that you just created a more of a traffic problem, and people have opted not to. So now you have a situation coming out of COVID with a lot of surge pricing, which has kept people from really kind of getting back into the Uber mode. So I would say that right now, Uber is not taking miles away as they have. But as things start to normalize a bit more, you'll see that adjust. But there was that mixing impact where I would say it was kind of negated in general in terms of what was added and what was taken away.
Okay. One more question on oil demand, and then we'll move, or I say two more questions. First off, we are at the end of summer driving season, so we should expect demand to drop somewhat. How much, when you look around globally, you have summer driving season coming to an end. You have lockdowns in Australia, New Zealand. You have things like protests going on in the world. But Goldman, I think, still is sitting on the $80 number. Uh, Maybe that was your answer.
Yeah.
You know where I'm going. Take
Yep.
it from there. That's question one, and then I'll get to question two. Go ahead.
So the problem is, and for some reason there's a view that Asia doesn't matter to the energy markets, and I don't know where that came from outside of anything to keep the narrative going. The problem is inflation hits every country differently, and every country in different ways that can be more impactful, less impactful in general. So when you look at the inflation situation, the uncertainty and the restrictions that have been put in place in other areas, I think there is a prolonged impact, especially when you turn to Asia. And things in the U.S. have gotten better, and we haven't seen the same type of surge because we do have vaccinations. We do have people that have maybe are having breakthrough COVID cases, but they're much less severe. And when you start going abroad and you look at the shortages, you look at the inflation, you look at a lot of these problems, that is going to continue to impact a lot of these demand numbers because they kept purchasing crude as if things were going to be normal, and then they were very far from normal. So you have India that it came way down in terms of their imports in July. You had China doing the same thing. And not to get too technical, but there's there's the paper market, and then there's the physical market. And when you look at the paper market, which is the futures, you can say, okay, well, future prices is this, that's looking forward. But then when you look at the physical market and you look at the significant discounts against benchmarks, against differentials, you're like, okay, well, that's not a lot of strength. And ESPO is one of the ones that comes out of Russia and goes into the in Northern Asia. And typically China pulls down a lot of that crude, and it's actually trading at a 5-month low, bringing us back to March levels. Then you look at West Africa, which is Nigeria, Angola, Congo, that they've been struggling to sell their crude. So you get these two different markets where the futures market is telling you the world is fine. There's not enough oil in the world. And then the physical market where countries are essentially begging you to take their stuff so that they can just move it into the world. And I think that there's that difference of when do the fundamentals catch up with the futures market, or when does the futures market catch up with the fundamentals? And that's where you keep going back and forth. And, as we've seen before, things can stay irrational longer than you can stay solvent. So you just have to be nimble.
Well, I'm going to say if 2020 taught us anything, it's that very lesson right there. Right? 2020, I will never forget the days where you'd turn on CNBC or Fox Business, and they'd have all their screens up. It'd be green, and the banner across the bottom: unemployment hits 100 million people, or whatever it was. And you're just like, what, guys? Yes. I don't know who's producing this show, but stop. Please stop. Please.
It's something. That's what. Well, it's just something. I don't know what it is, but it's something.
It's something. All right. The second question, and this is a pretty serious one, is how much more about oil and gas do you know than Big Oren?
So I will say that I have learned a lot from him over the years, and I look at the market from a much broader perspective because he's very much focused on the physical.
Oh yeah.
And the downstream. So I rely on him a significant amount on what is happening in the physical market. What is that telling us? And then I do more with the macroeconomics of where is this going to go from here when we start looking at, okay, well, India's, consumer consumer sentiment is at the lowest it's been in 10 years. And then I go back to where things were in 10 years ago to understand, what is that? What are the implications? So I look at things from just longer periods, and he's very much focused within the physical market and the refining side.
Yeah, for listeners at home, we retook that 10 times. Mark started out by saying so much more. I can't even explain how long you got. And it was like a 30-minute deal. He really was just trying big oar. And it took like 10 times for him to condense it down into that nice politically correct answer. Yeah, that was nice of you.
I try. He's a good friend.
I kept the real recordings of what you said, so we'll play those later date. So, no, I had to get my big orange shot in since you're on here. All right, we've got about 15, 18 minutes. Let's just kind of go through a little bit more rapid fire here. China, are they invading Taiwan?
They are not invading Taiwan in the near term. I think that they're using the situation in Afghanistan, which was a fantastic marketing opportunity for them, to take what is happening there and trying to project what does that mean for Taiwan? Is this really who you want to trust? I think the bigger issue that, not to say that Afghanistan isn't important, because it is, but when you look at Taiwan and you look at their relevance to our supply chain for everything from chips to servers to chips that go into our missile systems and our military systems, those things make Taiwan very important for our structure, for our IP. How many things are within Taiwan that we don't want China to have their hands on? There's a lot of reasons why it is going to be very different. So even though China is trying to play up, look at who you're relying on, these are the guys that will leave you high and dry. Anybody who knows supply chains, and let's be fair, when you leave the US, and because Americans tend to be a bit myopic and think they're the center of the universe, a lot of these other countries don't, and they realize that you can say what you want, but I know the U.S. needs us more than maybe even more than we need them, and I think that is something that is going to keep Xi skittish in terms of making any kind of aggressive moves against Taiwan.
Yeah, and the other thing is, I think, is that whatever the U.S. sentiment is towards China, the resolve from Taiwan's perspective,
yes,
they're pretty hardened. So,
well, and the thing is, they have a lot of assets, and you have to consider Taiwan's perspective, right? So it's parts of the country have mountains within it. They have very steep cliffs. So there's only very specific areas that you can land. And don't get me wrong, if anybody can mount an overwhelming force, it would be China. But you still have to cross the water. And the U.S. gave them Harpoon missiles. And for those that don't know, Harpoon missiles are very, very accurate and make a very large explosion that take out things within the vicinity of it. So they are a hardened area that would be very difficult to take. And for years, their whole structure has been survive an invasion for 2 weeks, because that's how long it would take the U.S. to mount a response. And that time period has shortened. And if you look at just where we have like the USS Ronald Reagan, where we keep a lot of these floating assets, it's within striking distance where it would not be a 2-week turnaround period, but something measured in days.
Yeah, and I think the thing is that when you talk about all that, essentially you're saying, does China want a hot war with the U.S.? And I don't really think that's what they want. I think that they're, when you look at how our economies are just commingled, I just don't think that's where they're at. And if you go back and read, have you read Peter Martin's China's Civilian Army yet?
I haven't.
So he talks about Mao and how Mao would use Taiwan for this exact purpose, which he would start, launching, attacks or talk about attacks on Taiwan. And it was really just to distract the public from, they're starving to death.
Right.
So you have to consider that China is a propaganda machine. I mean, they make our administrations look like, fools when it comes to propaganda. And so it's hard to always read what their true motivation is. And I think from the Western perspective, we look at them like, oh my gosh, they're flying a jet over there. They're ready to go to war, baby. Let's go get them. And they're like, bro, come on.
So, it's the concern is always what is going to drive action, and what drives action is the lack of basic necessities. So if you start looking at, the shortage of food, shortage of water, that's when you'll see an action drive forward, and to try to distract people from that, as you said, with Mao and the quote unquote Great Leap Forward, which killed 10 million people. If that starts to come back out, now the problem is or the benefit for China is they're in a very different place to try to rectify that than they have been in previous years. So that's when you start looking at India, what is happening along that border, where are they again along the Doklam Plateau? Because if you wanted to think about China wanting to drive south from the Doklam Plateau, you would pick up a lot of access to farmland, a lot of access to fertilizers, which they already have the BRI, or the Belt and Road Initiative, in Bangladesh, and they just signed a new one with Sri Lanka, which essentially puts them in a very good place to have assets within the Bay of Bengal. So then you start to look at strategically, how can they work this? And Taiwan, while makes them look bad because Taiwan's economy has far surpassed China on different levels. If you look, GDP per capita, what is the income per civilian? That's when you start to see some of these differences on, capitalism versus a more communist bent. So that's where it could be kind of like a show of force, like this is what we can do. But realistically, they need food and water. And how do you get that? And Taiwan is useless for when it comes to that. I mean, they're in their own drought. So right. You really need to come further south. And that's when I look at how would they get over the Himalayas? What is strategically important for them? How have they built helipads and railroads and ways to get around the Strait of Malacca, which then leads into why they've built facilities within in the stands in terms of Tajikistan and the areas around Afghanistan in terms of ways to get crude through the because the Himalayas are tall, so you have to take specific routes to try to go through some of the plains to get crude from Iran up, or ways to mitigate and try to create let's just say a supply chain that avoids the Strait of Malacca, which the U.S. and allies practices closing on a regular basis because you can't hide a submarine. It's so shallow, submarines have to come to the surface. So there's a lot of reasons why strategically coming down through or around the Himalayas makes more sense than trying to use brute force on the other side of the strait.
That was perfect. They're mowing my yard. I don't know if I can hear that or not. And the guy blowing was like literally blowing during your answer, like right there. And I was just like, please talk, Mark. Please talk, Mark. Please talk. Thank you. So you timed it perfectly. He's gone now. The second thing is, and I don't know how much this enters into Xi Jinping's thought process, but let's say theoretically he was considering doing what you're saying doing. It would be extremely foolish right now, in my opinion, to not look around geopolitically at the COVID lockdowns and the response that you're seeing with protests and riots in the streets and think, hey, now's a good time to go invade some other country, right? I mean,
yeah.
And so if you're a military strategist, and so this is my frustration with the China talk is, oh, they're so advanced thinkers, they're thinking out hundreds of years and all this stuff. Well, if you're an advanced military strategist and you're like, I'm going to go and take down a country right now at the most civil unrest in the last 100 years or 80 years, it's a risky strategy. You're going to get a bunch of pissed off people wherever you find them, whether it's in Texas or New Zealand or Australia or India, because the last year and a half has sucked for most of the population. And so to go invade somewhere right now, you better bring a big stick because you're going to find a bunch of pissed off people.
And so there's two sides to that. So there's one where they're not going to be unified, so they won't be able to mount a response. And then on the other side is you have people that are already angry and you become the unifying force that they will rally around to then take their anger internally and project it out. So there's two different ways to think about that.
Okay. I agree that is theoretically possible. The pushback I would say is that I don't know if anyone, listen, I am a pro U.S.-China relations. I think we should do business with China. I'm a free market guy. So I'm not like, hey, we should go bomb the commies. That's not what I'm saying here. I can just tell you, I have conversations with people around the world, and I don't know, but a handful of people who are like, oh, yeah, let's just trust them blindly. Most people look at China like, man, I don't know. Like, I'm not too sure about that, Now, if you're at the high government elite level, the conversation is a little bit different. But you talk to people on the ground, people do business. I don't know if their reputation can garner what you're saying there. And so I don't know if they have that capacity right now.
Well, the problem is when you look at doing deals with China, and when we were doing them back out of the Middle East in 2010, 2011, there was a view of that market is huge. It's fine. We'll give them what they want because we're going to make it up in numbers and volume. And none of that came to fruition. Most of these contracts are either so far underwater, cause bankruptcies, restructuring, that now people are kind of woken up to the fact of, okay, well, I agree, you have a lot of people, but not a lot of them are going to buy my stuff. So let's be very clear on what these terms are. And people have gotten smarter to ways of dealing with China, but how, there's such an integral part to the supply chain that you have to have some kind of understanding of what is happening on the ground. Now, we have taken action since then to diversify our supply chains. You're starting to see some of that move. But there was an interesting chart that I had on one of my shows just showing how much trade the different countries do with China. So obviously the US at 448 billion is the biggest, but Japan doing 112 billion. Well, how much of that 112 billion going from China to Japan is going then from Japan to the US? So then you start looking at the US and, okay, 448 billion is direct trade, but how much of it is indirect trade? And that's when you start to see the interwoven nature of where some of these supply chains are. And it's just, we've never been this connected. You can look at Germany in World War II and you can say, look, we were very connected, and we were to a point, but not to this level, not to this degree. And you could say, well, the economies are bigger, so economies of numbers, so everything gets bigger. But even if you adjust for that, our ties into China are much bigger than most.
Well, and the other thing I'll say is that we ran a show, episode 40, I don't know, 43, 44. I'll look it up. I'm talking here. And it was on the civil war going on in Cameroon. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not really familiar with the story. I've heard a little bit about it. I wanted to talk to someone, episode 44. And so essentially this guy comes on and he says that the French speaking Cameroons are waging war on the English speaking Cameroons. And if you type in hashtag Southern Cameroons on Twitter, you will find all kinds of atrocities going on.
Mm-hmm.
I'm taking this man at his word that the French are the aggressors here. I don't actually know because I don't know enough about what's going on. I'm not there, yada yada. But
right.
It's terrible what's going on. When you go back to Nazi Germany, there was no, and I say this over and over again, and I know we've talked about this. There is no WhatsApp picture. There are no Twitters. There are no Facebooks. There's nothing. So the people who knew, and you hear about like Ford going to Germany to work with them. It's very much the elites were the ones doing stuff, and they all kind of knew. The person on the ground, whether they wanted to know or not, they couldn't know, and that's the fundamental difference. So when you talk about, if China were to make this big, massive invasion, well, this isn't 1930. We only hear what the AP tells us, or whatever it is. People will be streaming it live on Facebook or Twitter or wherever, and so I think it's just hard for us in 2021 to think about the implications of that. When we went through last year, we saw the protests in the streets, or January 6th, or any of these things that happened. Everyone right then was instantly reacting to it, and we had all these emotions and reactions upon reactions. So I think we're in a different spot that makes it so much harder for those things to happen. When you talk about a massive invasion, moving troops onto places, maybe I'm naive, but I just think it's just a different world.
There's ways to, which is why they want to control so much of the media, the internet, because there's ways to try to adjust that. But as you said, there's ways around it. Now, you can also use that to your benefit. You look at ISIS, you look at Al Qaeda. They've used that significantly to their benefits to reach beyond what what their capabilities are. The problem that you look at when you start talking about like Cameroon, French versus English, we ignore in the U.S. at times the tribal backdrop. Like there is tribalism is very much a driving force. And if you turn to Afghanistan, what are Pashtuns versus Uzbeks? What are what are the Tajiks saying? Like what are Haras saying? Like versus the Pashtuns, or that Northern Alliance versus the Taliban. And not to say that the Pashtuns are all Taliban, because they're not. The Taliban is radicalized Pashtuns, but you're getting an idea of the tribal backdrop, which then becomes the underarching feeling of, because us in the U.S. and other places that even though we're, the U.S. isn't uniform because we're made up of so many different colors and types, but we have a unifying front. And I think sometimes we underestimate the ability of one tribal member picking up a gun, walking across the street and killing someone different, because that's just not what we think about. But that is very real, very much baked in. And I think that those are things that can really drive action, but that's more internal than it is external.
Right.
And I think that's where sometimes there's that confusion. But when you look at Arab Spring 2010, 2011, and then you look at 2020, 2021, you have the same price moves in food. You have another drought, which was actually very bad in 2010, 2011. You have tribal anger that it has the ability to branch out. So you could see a bigger destabilization. I personally do not think so, because I think each country, to your point, is facing their own internal battles, that they're not worried about what's happening. And you're already seeing some of this anger, but you're seeing it also more in Iran and Southeast Asia versus the Middle East. Like the Middle East is on the other side of that. If you look at Libya, not to say Syria is calm, but it's not where it was. But then, you look at Libya, but then you look at Lebanon, you look at some of these other areas that come into that MENA sector. And all of a sudden you're like, okay, well, there's some areas that you could start to see this again. But I just think that it'd be more localized versus some of these others where Southeast Asia, there's a bit more of a concern of, okay, well, could this go anywhere else? And I'm going to say no. Some will say that it could, but this is where some of that destabilization concern, because those tribes don't know borders. Borders, we made borders, like the English made borders. What these borders are haphazardly drawn across the map. So you have to look at, well, what is the carry through that tribe? Is there going to be a movement into some of the other stands, into Pakistan, into India? And that's why India is watching this closely, because they've been on the wrong side of different things, going back to, the 70s when the Russians came in and the U.S. armed the Taliban to help defeat and kick those Soviets out. So there's always been some uncertainty in that region.
Yeah. So I've said it like this. I think the map for the next 100 years will be drawn from the ground up. Right.
Right.
And so what you're referring to is these tribal disputes that don't necessarily have these arbitrary borders. What I'm pushing back against is the Treaty of Versailles, World War II, those type of things that redraw the map in such dramatic ways. I think we're beyond those days for where it gets the clock. We can talk about next time, but for a lot of reasons. The other thing I'll say is just on Taiwan. D-Day is a thing of the past. The reason we watch World War II aircraft carrier battles and all of this stuff and the Normandy invasion, those will never happen again. For those to happen, you would have to disable all of the satellites or whatever, how many satellites are. Because if you started loading up boats full of Chinese army, Marines or whatever they're called, and send them to Taiwan, every satellite that we have would detect that. And of course, there's submarines and cruisers and destroyers. And so this kind of, we live in a World War II mentality day to day, which is, wow, what if the Chinese land on the banks of Taiwan? Well, there would be a huge battle, a huge battle before a single Chinese troop ship ever landed on the beach of Taiwan, because they'd have to get there in secret, which they cannot do. And we can't do it either, to be clear. I'm not, right?
Yeah, well, that's why it's funny. Like a friend of mine, Jeff Healy, we talk about this, where this is the age of submarines. It's not, you can't be this big, gigantic surface force, because you can see that, where you have to be subsurface. You have to be, as you talk about being above the atmosphere, where you have to have an overwhelming force. And so can you take out the relays? So there's ways to take out the relays where, okay, the first force is, what are you going to do first? You're going to take out your radar, and you're going to take out your interlinks, because that's how you're going to disable or force them to run blind. And then once you do that, then you initiate an aggressive boots on the ground. The problem is there's a lot of ways to see boots on the ground. So then it has to become an overwhelming force. So how do you have an overwhelming force when you can run reconnaissance so quickly? One of the reasons why when you look at THAAD or the terminal high altitude anti-air defense. And when you look at THAAD and what the U.S. was able to do, we were able to put it into South Korea. And the reason why that was so important was because we utilized THAAD. And if a launch is initiated, every computer that's connected to THAAD starts working on what is the trajectory, where is it going to go. So you have essentially a supercomputer because you're linking so many of them together. So the closer you are to initial launch, the better you are, and it sees out. So getting us into South Korea enabled us to essentially see all the way through China, so nothing can surprise us. And that was because that is it's an air defense. It's not supposed to be on the aggressive side, but we like to invent things, and we've created ways to use those indications and that math to create a surface to surface attack. And that's when you start looking at more air defense and more ways to overwhelm a position. And that's why when you look at the stool or the tri-leg in terms of nuclear capacity, the idea was you want to have more nukes than they have sites, because you have to overwhelm them with force. So if you know that they have 100 air defense missiles, you need to launch 150 missiles knowing they're going to take out 100. So that's when you start coming into the law of numbers, the law of big numbers, and trying to become an overwhelming force if you can't make them run blind, which again, it would be a mixture of all of those.
Right, but nuking Taiwan would defeat the purpose of what China wants.
Which is why I say the boots on the ground. Like, it would have to be an overwhelming force, because you would need precision strikes, because the last thing you would want is take out a foundry, because you want that foundry. You don't want to take out that R&D site. You want that R&D site. So it would have to be precision. There's been some great individuals that have gone through how it would be a mixture of taking out satellites and then using an airdrop, then an invasion force, and it would be an overwhelming in terms of air, with boots on the ground, and then coming through the beaches. So there's ways to do it. It's just there would be massive loss of life, and sometimes you have to appreciate some people don't care as much about humans as we do.
That's true. And this is the final thing I know where it's clock here is that even then, if you took the satellite out, you would have to amass the troops after the satellite's taken out.
Right.
Because if you amass it before the satellite's out, then we know what's going on. And so, but the problem is once you take the satellite out, we also know what's going on. And so that's my thing, is like, it's not, and I know we're against clocks. We could debate this another time. My larger point is, this is not World War II, where June 6th, you wake up and you go, whoa, that's a bunch of ships out in the ocean. We're in trouble, right? It's just, It's simply not the case in 2021. And so all of these elements, they would trigger. Now, what the U.S. would do is a different story, but they would at least alert the U.S. that something was happening. So,
just like the one thing with World War II, and you look at D-Day, they were hiding, they had dummy sites, and there were a lot of things that worked in our favor in terms of cloud cover. Rommel wasn't there. He was at a birthday party. There's a lot of things that fell into line to make that a success. And it still was a huge cost of human life, because you still need an overwhelming force. And when you look at Taiwan, it's the same thing. Like, you could do whatever you want. You could try to hide it as much as you want, but we still know, we can still assume the numbers, but it would still have to be an overwhelming force and would cause a massive loss of life.
Could they get the ships to, like, on June 6th? What I'm saying is, could they even get to the point to where the ships are in the harbor, if you will? And that's what I'm not convinced of, because all of the sea warfare that had to go on, which they were able to avoid in World War II. So you'd have to get to Taiwan without the U.S. knowing and attacking. So anyways, let's save this. We'll get back to it next time. I know we're 6 o'clock here. Mark, where can people find you at?
So you can find me on Twitter. It's at Mark FNY. Always happy to talk on email. So it's mrossano@c6capitalholdings.com. I'm always available to talk and jam and go back and forth.
And you're on YouTube?
Yeah. So the YouTube channel is Primary Vision Network. PVN, we have a show every Wednesday looking at the EIA energy, bringing in big ORIN in the third section where I talk about physical. And then on Thursday, we have the macroeconomics and geopolitical show. Like we did a whole big thing on Afghanistan, what's happening there. And then on Fridays, we have our favorite, the Primary Vision Frac Spread Count show. And then just like a quick roundup of what's happened that week.
All right, Mark. Well, thank you again for coming on. We'll debate the Taiwan attack next time. And listeners,
sounds good.
Hey, also break down the Carol Baskin game film. It will be out between now and your next appearance. And with listeners, we'll talk to you. Let's see here. This is coming on Thursday, so I guess we'll talk to you next week.